Good morning.
Good morning.
What a delightful day to come together to know the truth, right? Amen. The scripture this morning that informs the message coming through me is one that we hear often in unity, and it is one that nevertheless holds great power for me. Unlike what often happens with overuse of a word, that its power might diminish. Over my time in learning and growing as a spiritual student of truth, Romans chapter 12, verse 2 has not diminished in its power. And it reads, "Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, and then you will be able to test and to prove what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." This transformation is a key word in understanding how spiritual power works, where spiritual power lives in us. And if we can't describe the power in words, we can certainly observe its function and make choices about how to transform it, either from a higher plane of consciousness to a lower one, or sometimes that transformation of energy, as modeled certainly by the Master, is about transforming it from the lower realm of the material dimension into a higher dimension. I'm so grateful this morning that Fillmore gives us what a teacher might call a pass when it comes to understanding spiritual power. In the first line of his chapter on spiritual power in the 12 powers of man, he just starts out by letting us know that we don't get it, which is, for me, very freeing. He just says that this power is least understood because each of us might not yet fully recognize its source as being one with us, with each of us. And so to read directly this sentence, he says, "Man does not exercise the power of his spiritual nature because he lacks understanding of its character and of his own relationship to the originating mind in which he exists." I mean, that's a mouthful. We need to embrace the fact that we exist in the mind of God. That makes us inseparable from that source. And he says the only reason that we do not exercise this power, which is spiritual power, is because we lack understanding about it. And so we move forward this morning in this time of hearing about truth, integrating truth, and above all, practicing the truth, to notice what it is that we do understand about spiritual power, and then taking some time to notice how that power expresses through each one of us. First of all, it's really wonderful to notice that the simplest definition of power, in terms of looking for a synonym, like what is this spiritual power? Those of us who have been immersed for half a lifetime in prayer practice as modeled by the unity philosophy are not surprised to learn that power is silence. Power is silence. From this power, we form thought. So the power is the silence. The thought is the formation of that power. And its expenditure or expression or releasing is the word, the spoken word. So these three truths will sustain me as I share with you what I understand about spiritual power and how I might better not only access it and recognize its origination in the one mind of which I am part, but also to notice what I'm doing with my energy, moment by moment, hour by hour, and day by day. So let me just repeat those three elements that will really form the backbone of the message. Power is silence. That silence takes on form through our thought. Each thought then expresses or releases or expends the energy of the silence through the words that we speak. Power then is from God, but power for God is how we use it. So it comes from our spiritual nature, and used rightly, it is used for God. Does that make sense so far? So silence manifesting first in the form of thought, and then expressing as a, get this, vibratory frequency, which is the words that we speak. This power and dominion, we know this, was implanted in each and every one of us from the beginning. From the beginning. But how aware am I of how I am dedicating this power on a daily basis in my daily life as a power for God? How am I doing that? How conscious am I of that? There is such a thing, and certainly I just want to share as a temporary aside, that the 6 classes that we just completed as a community have really uplifted and sustained me in a way that should last until the next class. Part of what came up in the healing component of our classes was the teachings of Carolyn Mace. She has a very interesting power-related teaching. And she says, if I'm not in charge of my energy when I start my day, then why am I surprised when my energy flows somewhere that weakens me? So my first job in consciousness is to notice that I do have this spiritual power, that it lives in the silence. So we could actually finish our talk right there, because it seems to me that the amount of time that I spend in silence with that power is directly commensurate to how much of God I am expressing, first in thought form, and then in what I am speaking forth into my daily life. So she talks about something very interesting to me. Carolyn Mace says, there was for a time in society, and she believes we're moving out of it now, an addiction to what she calls woundology. It's a coined word that comes from focusing on repeating, retelling, believing, affirming the same old story of suffering, of a wound. You know, I listened to one of her workshops, and as soon as she had said, "Are you addicted to your woundology?" She said, "Because it's a choice." She said, "We can look at anything that we've called suffering in our lives." And again, this is from the silence to the thought to what we're speaking out loud. We can look at it, and she said, we can simply glean or mine from it only the gold. And so she puts this, as any good teacher does, in very simple terms. Am I living in the wound, in the woe, or in the wisdom? Because if I'm living in the wisdom through gaining power, resting in silence, then I can see that everything I might have called a wound or seen as woe has actually got me to my current level of spiritual power, of spiritual understanding, and above all, of being responsible for where I'm directing my energy. She said, have you ever paid attention to when your energy goes weak during the day? And I'll come back in a minute to the workshop, but she gives a very trivial example of someone drinking from a certain cup or something, and somebody sitting next to her saying, "Oh, do you like that kind of cup?" And she says that's how easily we can let go of our positive energy, is to somehow agree with whatever we're telling might be the intention in that, when it has nothing or less than nothing to do with us. So she says it is a consciousness of where we are targeting our energy, where we are willing to expend it, that determines the quality, really, of a life that is vital, that is vibrant, that is uplifted, and above all, that is full of the energy and the power of spirit. And so we ask ourselves, how attached do I still feel? And you notice I will not put the I am with that particular statement. How attached might I still feel to the woe, to the story, to the woundology of the past? When I retell it to someone, am I coming from a place of wisdom? And it's a practice. It is a practice of catching ourselves in the middle of retelling any part of our story and making the focus of it, yes, oh, and I've suffered, and oh, the wound, and oh, what happened next, and then we're gone, right out of the realm of true spiritual power, which originates in silence, is formed by thought, and then has a frequency that I'm creating through the word that I'm choosing. And so this woman puts up her hand in the workshop, and she said, well, you know, I definitely have suffered. Like, I've really gone through a lot, and, you know, my childhood, and she energizes it. And she said, so am I understanding you that I'm not supposed to talk about that if I'm healed, that I'm never supposed to bring it up again? And then Carolyn says a very interesting thing. She says, we all need a sacred witness to our suffering, initially. And she said, and you know what? You might need more than one witness, your therapist. You might need another witness, a dear friend. And you might choose someone in your spiritual community as a sacred witness to hear that. She said, but when are you complete? When is enough of the wound? And when can you take that wound and see it as the wisdom that without it, you would not be where you are right now. And so the woman, the student who had asked the question said, oh, okay, so it's about how many times I tell it. And Carolyn May said, yeah, how many times do you need to tell it? And then ask yourself, what or how is that serving you? Because there's a payoff. And the payoff might just be to keep feeling crummy. You notice I say that with a smile on my face because it's always a choice. And she says, if you keep telling the same story in the context of a wound, then that's what will happen, is that you will vibrate at the frequency. And those of us who studied together know that Dr. Hawkins places the frequency of guilt, of shame, of regret, of anger, all below the frequency that first starts us at a spiritual journey, which is 200. And 200 calibrates at the courage that we have that usually comes out of getting angry. And a lot of us have shut down anger as a negative emotion. And certainly that brings me into the next function of spiritual power. When we spend time with our spiritual nature and with the source of true power in the silence, we then form thought which is uplifting, which can be expressed then in a vibratory frequency that reflects our oneness with Source, which means that we have causative joy, causative peace, causative harmony, abundance, and every other attribute of God, because we have started with power in the silence. So, as a praying community, we might ask ourselves, how much of my day is dedicated to being one with spiritual power in the silence? Am I injecting 5 minutes at different times during my day to just rest in the silence to re-energize my thought, so that that thought then expresses only as a frequency above courage, which moves into the other harmonious attributes of God. It is interesting that Charles Fillmore defines power and uses Jesus as the ultimate example of the right use of power as the ability to transform energy from one plane of consciousness to another. Do I think of myself as a power transformer? Each one of us is transforming energy all the time. But the consciousness, the awareness that we bring to letting go of the woundology, letting go of the story from the past, letting go of wherever we might be stuck, to put on a lens through which we see only celebration, wisdom coming through all of it. So that now when we repeat that story, it's, wow, and guess what I got from not being allowed to go to the Bahamas to teach at the Anglican College in 1993, when a court order came to my office and said, you can't go with your 3-year-old. Guess what I got? And I'm getting the shivers right now from head to toe. What I got from that was the wisdom that I would have abandoned my relationship with a child who was not in my custody and who was my daughter and was the reason why I was doing what I had done, which was to run. Run away from the pain and blame the ex-husband who got the court order. Oh no, now I bless him. I lift him up with gratitude and recognize that had that part of my story not resulted in my deciding to stay put, I would not, I feel confident at least, that I wouldn't have the relationship that I do now with my oldest daughter, which is pure and loving. And understanding and also healing. Because she can tell the truth of how she saw her wound in that story. And I can share how for me, it's not a wound. It's a pearl of wisdom. So our invocation as we go forth this week into our daily lives is to choose the wisdom rather than the woe. To spend time in the silence knowing that even though Fillmore warns us that we do not really understand this faculty of spiritual power, that the way for me to understand it is to notice how it functions. One of its functions, believe it or not, is to transmute or to transform emotions into a purified state. And you might say, wow, how does that work? Especially those of us in the 6 series of classes that have looked at our emotions and realized that the first step is to freely allow them to rise in us and to accept them rather than resist, label, judge, criticize, and above all, push them down. The faculty of spiritual power, because it resides in silence, is powerful to transform emotions, particularly negative emotions. But all emotions, have you noticed that emotions are noisy? Have you noticed that they clamor for attention? Yes. And if we can invoke our spiritual power in the silence, resting in silence, open and receptive to the guidance of our spiritual nature, to have those feelings come up and then to bring them into the frequency of spirit, whatever they are, to purify them and to release them through the spiritual faculty of our power. We are always making choices, folks. As I like to remind myself, every decision in mind is a choice for heaven or hell. I'll say that again because I think I need to hear it again. Every decision in mind is a choice for heaven or hell. I don't know about you, but most moments in consciousness, I choose heaven, the kingdom of heaven that's waiting for me. It will not pressure me. It will not scream ruckus shrieks to get my attention. Only energy and motion as feelings does that. But when I can abide in the silence of my true nature as spirit, when I can truly reside in that silence, then I am uplifted into a state of purification, where those feelings can return from whence they came. So if what is really holding us back from a life of freedom, of uninterrupted joy, of harmony, of health, of wellness, of abundance, and of connectivity with other souls, if the only thing that's holding me back is my understanding that I have this power and this dominion that is from God and needs to be used only for God, then I will be in charge of the fact that this silent power takes form first in my thoughts. What am I thinking most of the time? Because those thoughts will then express a vibratory frequency which will be anywhere on the scale, from shame all the way up through to those emotions that vibrate above the frequency of 200 as calibrated by Dr. Hawkins, into those emotions where we abide in a consciousness of our spiritual power and are joy-filled, peaceful, loving, and kind, And that becomes the natural outpouring of the spiritual power which we have made a deliberate choice to align with in the silence. Does that make sense? Are we ready to be transformers of energy from one plane to another? Try it. Try it with the first personality that looks like they might get on your nerves today. There might be one, because those teachers show up all the time. And I'll close my message this morning by sharing with you an example of this as I rested in consciousness about this power that's waiting for me to mold and shape it in my thinking. I approached the border guard and I said to myself, I love him. I really love this guy. I hadn't even seen him, right? And learning by contrast continues to be my greatest opportunity, where I can be the objective observer of myself and go, wow, look at you and how you did that differently than, say, the first 15 years you came through this border. Because what he said to me could have been, in the past, and I'm wise, not wounded, such a trigger. Because, we got over the niceties, and then he said, so, you come over here every Sunday? And I went, I love this guy in my mind. So I didn't try to, have the intellect shape a thought. I thought I trust whatever comes out. And I said, I'd like to, but I really don't right now. And then he gave his motivation for asking what was a vibratory match for what I was emitting. He said, oh, I just wanted to tell you in case you're coming next Sunday, it's the Grand Prix. To which I said, that is so kind of you to think about my doing that. Then I went, light bulb. I won't be coming next Sunday. And of course I didn't tell him because it's my Sunday off.